All right. So for the webinar today, we have a super interesting topic. The webinar is called "Do Reps Have No Path to Quota?" We have here Ryan, who is VP of Sales and RevOps from QuotaPath, and Brantley, who is CEO of Forgeworks. And I'm gonna hand it over to you guys to introduce yourselves, introduce the topic, and take it away from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here. Uh, I've had the pleasure of working with Brantley in a number of capacities with via QuotaPath, both as a customer while at Hopin, and then consulting a number of our customers as well, which has been a fun journey. But hi, I'm Ryan. I lead the sales, marketing, and RevOps teams here at QuotaPath. QuotaPath helps you use your comp plan to actually drive to close more revenue that's better for your business. So both saving time, calculating and paying commissions, but also actually driving the right behavior. To spend a lot of time talking to teams about quotas and excited to chat about this more today. And I'll kick it over to Brantley to introduce himself too.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Great to see everybody. I'm Brantley. I'm CEO of Forgeworks.AI. We're a RevOps agency that helps companies deploy and build out revenue operation functions. I was previously a VP of Revenue Operations and a VP of GTM, so I've led sales and marketing teams and have built comp plans and quotas for hundreds of sales reps, both the companies I've worked at and 30 plus companies that we've helped consult over the last year or so. And so getting quotas right is something not only I enjoy doing, but I often say, if you show me somebody's comp plan and their quota, I'll tell you the results you're going to get, because I think that is a significant part of what drives outcome in sales and marketing teams. So excited for this conversation, excited to be here. We're obviously QuotaPath partners, and we're excited to have this conversation with Ryan and QuotaPath.
And yeah, thank you so much, Brantley. We're a newer sponsor for Rev.Hub, and so have like an exclusive discount on our product for Rev.Hub members. So definitely inquire. 15% off discount of the product for Rev.Hub members. And I also run free compensation plan consulting. So if you do want a second set of eyes on your comp plan, I'll drop my Calendly in the chat. Feel free to grab time with me. And we can talk about your comp plan in a more detailed one-on-one. Or if Travis, you could drop it, that'd be great too. So today we're going to talk about a couple. Oh, and one thing I should say specifically is if you have questions, please just throw them in the chat, and we'd be happy to answer them for you. And we'll kind of like bring them into the conversation itself. These are much more fun when they're conversational. So please throw your questions in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it, and then we can like bring them up over time. We'll talk a little bit about like team-wide versus rep level misses, Brantley's experience with both, my experience with both, how you modify. We'll do like talk a little bit through the math of that and recommendations and what we keep in mind. Some tactics for recovery if you do find yourself either as a IC contributor, team leader, what have you, in a miss scenario, and just some best practices for future misses to avoid future misses. Brantley and I'll go back and forth. But again, please, if you do have questions, definitely drop them in and we'll talk about them soon. So this was I posted on LinkedIn about this. A bunch of people were excited about this topic. I think missing quota is it's a very heart-wrenching topic that people were excited about. So I was very excited about this to have this conversation too. So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about, and this is like the kind of the systemic root of the problem, was how you think about setting like quota coverage versus your overall revenue plan and how like best practices for that. So Brantley, I'm kind of curious, as you've designed compensation plans in the past, like how have you approached that quota coverage of your revenue plan problem? And what are some tips you have for people who might be setting quotas off a revenue plan for the first time?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. So there's a lot of different types of businesses and how they're setting quotas. Venture-backed business and a business that may be bootstrapped or is self-funded. There's really starting with the total compensation, total financial plan of the company. And you got a little more leverage depending on if it's VC-backed or not. If it's VC-backed, you may have higher pressure from the board to hit specific numbers. And you need to work backwards into the quota so that if you can hit that quota, you can hit the board plan. Not everybody has a board plan, and so that's still maybe an internal conversation with the C-suite, whoever's running that company, to make sure that the quotas that you're setting ultimately hit the total financial picture, both quarterly, semi-annually. And so that's kind of the end goal. But oftentimes that's where people start and stop. And that's where people feel like there's no path to quota, because it's more than just simply dividing the target by X amount of reps and, hoping that you hit it. And so that's hopefully, we're going to spend more time to talk about how to build that.
Yeah. And so some of the things that I've heard historically have been you want 80 to 90% of quota coverage, in terms of 80 to 90% blended attainment to hit a revenue plan that you set. I've been advising teams to actually have that be like a tighter number, like upwards of 90% overall required quota attainment, especially when you think about the headcount cost of extra reps, to have like a thinner margin than you would expect previously, like in a ZERP market, between the required quota attainment and your like revenue plan, has like been starting to shift more to my recommendation, because it leads to also much better rep engagement. The less reps you can have who can share, both the inbound and outbound pipeline and overall team resources. So we've seen a number of our customers recently actually optimizing more towards 95% required quota attainment to hit board plan. The problem you have to keep in mind there is, how do you set targets for like your mid and upper level managers to make sure that there's a little buffer for them too?
Yeah, I think that buffer can always be a little bit of a tough sell, because it depends for the higher, particularly for the managers and above, because you want to make sure it's attainable for them too. Because if the company's like, hey, this is what we need to hit, and then you work backwards into the numbers, you want to make sure that, for instance, marketing and business development have the resources to generate the pipeline for sales to hit their quota. And so if the board plan is set at a too high of not enough coverage, then they're not going to have the resources in the budget to produce the pipeline to hit the target. They may have a strict quota of, plus 10% or plus 15%. And so the numbers have to work out, and finding that right balance to where you're accounting for a gap and maybe a few attainment drops, but also making sure the budget, the finance is actually approving, support the pipeline generation and the headcount to hit that. So I think, 5 to 10% coverage gap it makes sense. I think I'm in favor of a smaller gap, but larger companies definitely, I think, maybe have a precedence for what they've done in the past, and that's just because that's what they've done, rather than what makes sense for the team and the market today.
And so, one of the first things we talk about, if you find a team that's missing, or your blended attainment's not where you want it to be, is like, first is identifying kind of where the problem is in your process. We'll talk about the entire team missing, or just a few reps missing, but they're missing consistently, and like where in your funnel is the miss coming from? And we were prepping for this, Brantley and I were talking a little bit about, okay, like there's a million different ways your blended quota attainment could be 60% as a team. It could be 3 reps really having a tough time. It could be all your reps not hitting your number. And so like understanding the mechanics of the why will like lead to what you should be thinking about doing next. So let's start the first scenario, Brantley. Let's just do an example. Hey, the org ends the quarter at less than 70% blended attainment, no reps above 85. So like no rep is really crushing it. How do you come into an org, you're advising an org that has 20 reps, and they told you, hey, these quotas no one's hitting plan. What are some of the first questions you're asking to like help them prepare for what's next?
Yeah, and this is definitely not uncommon. A lot of times it has to do with how companies have thought about how they generate quotas. It's kind of crazy, but it wasn't that too many years ago where it was just basically a headcount times quota, right? So if your target was 10 million, you had 10 people, then everybody gets $1 million quota. And then it was like, well, if you want to do 15 million, hire 5 more people and get them, or hire six more people and give them each $1 million quota and account for 80% to hit. And there's just an assumption that the demand was almost kind of a given based off the headcount. And so it's really rethinking and asking the questions, how is a company thinking about demand generation? Because the ability to hit quota is a function of the ability to create revenue engines from the top of the funnel all the way through. And that's usually where I start looking, is if the entire org is missing, how is the quota set originally, right? Is it top down? Is it bottom up? How are companies thinking about it? But ultimately thinking about, how does a company think about leading and lagging indicators that gives confidence in the quota attainment? Do they have a plan to hit quota beyond just head counts? And that's oftentimes, more often, at least companies I'm working with, it's not really clearly defined because teams haven't been able to build demand generation. So that's usually where we end up focusing is what are the metrics need to be happening in order for quota to be the outcome? And then what do those demos look like? What do those leads look like? What's the close rate? What's your average sales cycle, the average sales price, and really defining a pipeline and then building strategies so that reps have confidence they can hit, teams have confidence they can hit the following quarters. That's been usually what I see if an org is missing, is that pipeline or demand generation is just not refined enough where it needs to be yet.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about. I think a lot of people will say, hey, we're going to close, 5 million in new business this year across 5 reps. What I tend to push people to say is, okay, that means you'll have to create 20 to 25 million in pipeline this year. Like, and that's across, you have a 10K ACV, so that's across 2,000 opportunities. Are there 2,000 customers? My Wi-Fi is lagging a little bit, but are there 2,000, if you create 2 million, or excuse me, 20 million in pipeline with a 10K ACV, are there 2,000 businesses who you think will be able to evaluate your product this year? And how does that fit within your overall TAM penetration, for example? And so when you push on a lot of that math, that's where a lot of these plans tend to fall apart. Is sure, you maybe last year 1 rep closed 1 million off of 5 million in pipeline. You can't just hire 5 times more rep demand gen.
Yeah, sorry, Ryan, your audio broke out towards the
I
end
cut out
there.
a little bit. I'm interested in your take of like the dragging of the math, apparently. And I might just switch my Wi-Fi in a second. My Wi-Fi is being a little challenging.
That's right. And it's the easy way I think about it is pipeline coverage. And so it's really napkin paper math. It doesn't require advanced analytics. You can do this with large companies doing hundreds of millions of revenue. You can do it with companies doing 1 to 2. And you need to think through your average sales cycle. How long does it take to close a deal? Average sales price, and your close rate. And if you know those things, you're going to be in a really good position to think through your pipeline generation to hit quota. So for easy math, if Q3's quota in total is $1 million across the board, and you have a 10% close rate, you're going to need $10 million in pipeline going into that quarter if your sales cycle is 45 days or less. It does mean that the first month of Q3, you can generate some pipeline, but if you don't have 10x coverage with a 10% close rate, you're going to be in a tough position to with high confidence say that you can hit that. And that's really not advanced forecasting. That's just thinking through, hey, don't just put that out there and say go hunt for it, because even advanced companies with lots of money raised and really smart people will be mid-quarter and be like, all right, we got to go find it. And you looking at the numbers, you're like, guys, it's a 45-day cycle. The numbers you've got to hit, you're now thinking about next quarter, and their minds are like, the sales team, go find it, but somebody needs to be thinking about the next quarter and this quarter, and there has to be a target, so you're setting up the next quarter in quotas for success. And then that means that's where it comes into demand generation, which is why I'm separating it from just general marketing and general lead, is thinking through pipeline as a function of engineering, as a function of process, as a function of marketing and sales development, so that there's somebody who can talk through and say, in order for us to do $1 million in sales next quarter, we need to have $10 million in pipeline. If you go, I can't do $10 million in pipeline, it's not possible for any number of reasons. You've got 3 options. You can increase your average sales price. So maybe you talk through, how do you bundle your packaging? Is there an enterprise option, or depending on what you're selling, to increase your average sales price? The other thing is close rate. Understand what your close rate is at. If you're at 8%, if you can get to 15%, you don't need this highest coverage. If you're closing it at 20% close rate across the sales team, you only need 5x coverage, right? So that's where you can start to figure out, how do you influence the outcome? And that's where you're building a path to quota, and that's where the strategy comes in, both as an individual and as a strategic leader. So head of sales, RevOps, CROs, you're looking at the numbers and you're starting to build that plan of saying, great, in order for this rep or this team to hit $1 million, these are the metrics we need to hit to put those things together, from a function of where we're at and what needs to change.
Well, and one of my favorites that you brought up that I think a lot of people don't ask is if you look at a given quarter, what percentage of the revenue that you're closing in that quarter was created in that quarter versus in previous quarters? And if you find yourself in a business with a, 6-9 month sales cycle and you're missing, that miss is going to carry over for a couple quarters if you have to like dramatically increase your pipeline overall. And it's a fluid dynamics problem, which I think a lot of people don't spend time with. And so really there's two problems that I like to focus on with a team-wide miss. One is, to your point, do you have enough pipeline in the right place at the right time in order to actually hit your number? And as you move throughout the course of the quarter, one of my favorite curves is how much more, like in a quarter, how much more pipeline do you expect to be created in this quarter that could still close in this quarter, right? And like as you get to the end of the quarter, that becomes nothing, basically. So that's like the pipeline decay curve is one that I think every leader should build, and it's a pretty straightforward one to build mathematically. But then the other one is actually on a per person basis, can a person on this team physically support the amount of work they would have to do to hit this number? So if you have a 200K quarterly quota with a 20K ACV, you got to close 10 deals. Okay. What does it actually take physically to close 10 deals? Maybe you have to run 5 to 10 calls per deal. Maybe you have to, those take this period of time. Like how, if you put yourself in the rep shoes starting the quarter, how do you actually build the plan for this person to hit this number? And I think a lot of senior leaders are dragging 90% attainment in an Excel doc and bringing it over column by, quarter by quarter and ramping up the number of reps they have and just saying, okay, we're going to hit this number. But people aren't treating it enough like this, like fluid dynamics problem.
Yeah, I think when you think about building a quota and how do I build a path to quota, you've got the strategic finance perspective, finance RevOps. You've got the sales component, and you have the individual reps. And so they all break down into reverse engineering how you're going to get there through these key components, activities, deal size. If you're an SDR or BDR, your quota may be meeting set or accepted meetings. And so really working backwards and understanding every detail is going to be key. Ideally, you've got a head of sales or somebody that can help you with that, but that may not always be the case. And so if you're dollar heavy and you get a 6% average connect rate, how many meetings do you need to set per connection? And then you start to work your way through of, okay, if your quota is 12 accepted meetings a month, how many activity points you need to be doing each week, each day, so you can generate the activity you need to hit that. That's a really good place to be as an individual. Not all the teams can set that up, but that's, I think, the responsibility of the sales reps, so they're just not always reacting to that number. And basically, I'm going to work as hard as I can through a task list. That's a really tough place to be, particularly for a junior rep. The same thing applies to an account executive, or even somebody who's doing renewals, is being able to work backwards and think through your pipeline in advance of that and say, great, if I've got, we'll talk through, I think, commits and best case type of forecasting, but if I've got a pipeline of $500,000 and my quota next quarter is 250, that's not good enough. That's going to require 50% close rate. So it may sound good, like, hey, I've got 500K in deals, but unless those are late stage with high close probability, that's going to roll over into the next quarter. You got to work backwards and think, how many new deals do I need to self-generate? How many is the company providing? So that quota is an output that is engineered based on input activity and things it can own, so that it's much more of a process generated approach on the rep level. And that function still keeps going up towards the strategic level for the company.
So it seems like we have two big takeaways here. First takeaway is, as your org thinks about raising plan and thus raising corresponding quota, you have to figure out how you could possibly generate that much pipeline, right? And how you could generate that much pipeline in a leading period that you have enough time to close it in the period that you're trying to land. So if you're thinking for 2026, we got to move from 3 million in new business to 7 million in new business. How would you actually deliver 7 million in new business in the year 2026? And specifically, how could you generate enough pipeline early enough, really like in Q3 and Q4 of this year, to set you up for the quarters you would need in Q1 through Q4 of 26 to be successful? So there's like a pipeline math mechanics question, which seems like one that if you're a revenue leader or an ops leader, you have to have a really good grasp on to say, what gives me the right to say we could close that much revenue? Then the
That's right.
second piece is how do you build kind of a bottoms up activity model for a seller, for an account manager, for somebody who's handed a 200K quota? What is their actual day-to-day going to look like in terms of time spent on their calendar to justify that number? And if you were in that person's shoes, how would you feel and what would you game plan to actually get to that number? I want
Yeah.
to hit a little bit, Brantley. There was a question in the chat about activity-based selling, our take on activity-based selling. Specifically, it seems like activity-based comp seems to be the theme, but let me know if that's not the theme of the question. But it said on both the sales dev and sales sides, like, do you do activity-based sales with AEs? My guess is that that's more of a comp plan question. Like, should you be comping on activity-based work? So interested in your take there, Brantley.
Yeah, I think if we could clarify, we're talking about copying on activity, or is the using activity-based sales as a management technique?
I'm not exactly sure.
Let me clarify. I was asking a question. So it's not about comping the activity. The sales development part is like super measurable activities and everything. And they seems like more fluid. When you talked about Ryan, you said, okay, I have a quota. Can I close it? It's very tough to engineer sales itself versus sales development. So we can get to that level of granularity and engineering and say, okay, if we change that lever, we can expect a 20% increase in revenue from a rep. So do you have any experience in how can you influence that? I think this is like part of the larger discussion here, right?
Yeah, so
Sure.
it's basically how do you build the same activity-based funnel for a sales rep, right? Now, there's a couple ways you can think about it. I spend a lot of time with this in terms of stage progression. In order for how many, if you have 10 closed won deals a quarter, that means you need 25 qualified deals. That means you need to run 175 demo occurred deals. That means you need to create, 250. So you can use stage progression as a way to build the funnel. Is one way that I've done it before to say, hey, of the ops that we run a first demo of, what percentage of them move down funnel to get to the number of deals you need to close in order to hit your revenue plan? So that's one. And then does your rep have the capacity to run 250 demos a quarter if that's your close rate? So that's like question one, I would say. And then question two is actually just like pure call volume. And so I've done a lot of work with our customers to say how many like Zoom calls does it take you to close a deal? Like, is it 2? Is it 4? And a lot of sales leaders can't say that, like don't have their average. QuotaPath, it's like 2 and 2.3, I think right now. But like having that number of how many calls from op creation to closed one deal is very valuable as you think about human capacity, because you basically have to say, let's say 70% of your closed one revenue is created and closed in quarter. Okay, well then this person's got to run 10, 200, 300 calls, like from just like in how they're managing their day. And so doing that math, I think also becomes quite fruitful. So hope that answers the question. Brantley, I don't know if there's anything else we wanted to add there, but I tend to think about it as a stage progression funnel, one, and then a just time on the phone question. And doing the calendar math is always very helpful.
If I'm working with a new org, one of the first things I'm doing is just making sure there's a baseline understanding of average sales price, time to close rates. And if those aren't known per rep, per team, per region, et cetera, and really with high confidence, that's always the starting place. And not every place does. Not every rep should know that for themselves, and every team should know it, because that's where you work backwards from the quota. And you say, great, in order to hit these targets, this needs to be true. We need to have a 20% close rate. If you've got a rep at 12%, you immediately got a coaching opportunity to figure out how to get to close rate. Or if you're like, hey, this requires a 30% close rate. Now you've got to have a conversation about Is that realistic? Now you got to increase the sales price. Products, rolling out new pricing. Hey, this is great. We're going to drop our pricing from X dollar to this price. Well, if the quotas don't change, you've increased the volume count. So if you have those variables, you have a lot of strategic leverage from a leader perspective, but also a rep to go back and say, what do I need to generate? And so now you get into the activity of, okay, if I need to close 20 deals to hit my number, how do I get those 20? Am I getting all those from the company? Am I self-generating? Or is it 50-50 split? And that's where you start to figure out what is from an AE perspective, what is the weight that they need to self-generate? So maybe 30%. So it's setting expectations around, maybe some organizations may be 100% self-generated. Where is that pipeline going to come from? Ryan made a good comment around 70% closed in quarter. So understanding how much you should expect from, what if you generate a deal, generate pipeline in quarter, what's the likelihood of that rolling over, that waterfall, the fluid dynamics Ryan mentioned around how much of that leads into the next, so that you're not just sales reps that have blinders on, both good and bad, of in month and quarter. And that's okay for an individual sales rep to a degree, but you need to be able to zone out and setting up next quarter by doing the right activities today and understanding how much is going to roll over. And so I don't think it gets much more complicated than that. I think once you boil it down to average sales price, sales cycle, and close rate, you know the gap, and that starts to create strategic initiatives around how do you generate that? Is it realistic? If it's not, what do you need to change to engineer both individual and company-wide quota attainment?
And I think you're doing all of this in the service of convincing a rep that they can hit their number. Like not even just convincing, explaining to them why you're confident they can hit their number. So like when we raised our quotas this year, we had a strong year last year. Team was like 100% blended quota attainment all 4 quarters last year. And I went to the team and our board said, hey, we can probably drive more revenue out of this engine. I said, I agree. I asked the reps, hey, do you want me to hire more reps or raise quotas? Obviously, every rep said, I want you to raise my quota. Don't bring anybody else on. And so we went through the systems math of why I felt like they each had a plan to hit their number. You have to run this many demos. This is what it's looked like on a per person basis. These are the pricing changes we're going to make. And this is the math that sets you up for success. And that's ultimately what this is all in service for. And if you have those assumptions when you're rolling out a plan, when somebody falls off track, you can go to them and be like, hey, the reason you're not hitting your number is either because you're not self-generating enough pipeline, or your ACV is too low, like your mid-market win rates, whatever the thing is driving the deviation. You have to set that path when you roll out the quota so that when they miss, you can talk to them about why they're missing. Interesting question from Ben around, like, what do you consider as generated pipeline? My strong opinion on this is that it has to be standardized. Like whatever the mechanic is, has to be standardized on a person by person basis. The way that we do it at QuotaPath is if you book a demo. So we have a demo button on our website. If you book a demo with QuotaPath, we create an opportunity. And now that allows us to track op creation show rate from demo appointment to demo occurred. We have very clear definitions of if they're in a validation stage, qualified stage, and closed one. We keep the stages pretty simple. But you have to standardize, in my opinion, Ben, you have to standardize the definition, because if reps are all running off of different denominators and they are creating ops when they feel like it's an op, then none of your math works because you're not treating your reps on a even basis. I don't know, Brantley, if you have any thoughts there.
I agree. It needs to be defined per company. And so MQLs, SQLs, deals, opportunities, depending on the CRM, those are all pipeline. Different people may own different stages of that: sales development, demand generation, marketing, account executives. We haven't mentioned much about it, but that still applies to renewals and upsells and cross-selling. There is in general, it's always boils down to, in my mind, you build this thing out, a function of quantity and conversion rate. And so in general, if you've got 10 book of demos online, 2 out of 3 of those are going to attend your meeting. Hopefully you get a higher show rate, but maybe you get 2 out of 3 show rate. Of those online bookings for inbound, you may be looking at 1 out of 3 actually being qualified. And then once they're qualified, now you've got a deal for a rep. And then once you've got a discovery call, that discovery call may have on average a 10% close rate. Each company is being a little bit different, but if I'm a sales lead or a RevOps, you've got to know that stone cold for your business, so you can understand if there's a drop. You're like, hey, we missed 70% of our target. Going back to the original question, why was it missed? Or did you build? Should that have been off of a 20% close rate? So maybe there's a new competitor in the market. Maybe there's new pricing, new features, and your close rate is getting hit. Or maybe you thought you're going to sell more of a product, so your average sales price is lower than you thought. Or simply you just didn't get enough volume, you didn't get enough higher demand. Then you work up the funnel and figure out where those drop-offs are happening, so you know where to fix. Maybe it's total volume in the marketing funnel. Maybe, I like Ryan's model of just it's straight to the AEs, but if you got a sales development team, maybe they're working off of NQLs, and a big part of their pipeline is self-generating. They need to do outbounding demand generation, and there's a certain target they need to hit, and they're going to have their own conversion. But building that funnel and understanding the quantity and conversion rate for each step of what it should be and where you are is absolutely critical to tracking a path to quota. And most importantly, those are leading indicators. So if you're at the start of the quota and you're generating and half of your inbound leads are not qualified or more, and you're expecting higher, you've got an indication that you're going to be off mark for your quota for the end of the quarter, rather than waiting. And it gives you time to course correct when you're able to monitor in real time how your funnel is supposed to be working and how it is.
Yeah, and you can do like a mathematical call versus, based on how much pipeline you've generated so far in the quarter. Like, do you have a path? And a lot of these tools, like the gongs and the forecasting tools of the world, do a really good job of this. But you can actually own a lot of this as you're getting started too, is to have a good handle of your math. I think. Oh, sorry, Brantley, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and when you know that stone cold, with a good RevOps team, or once a sales lead or somebody builds that out, and even rep for their own, you can start making with pretty high confidence in a quarterly quota scenario. By the end of month one, I would say you should have a really high confidence of where you're going to land as a company, as a quota. The reps may not know that yet, and they may have a big whale deal or something individually that may shift. But from a team, if you've really built out your funnel, you can forecast where you're going to land in quota with 95% accuracy. And if given enough heads up, you can start making changes to that and say, if we don't generate an extra 25 deals, for instance, in this next month, we're going to miss quota. But if we can, in this month, generate 25 new deals from these specific channels, we can course correct and get back on the company hits target. That becomes the path to quota, is knowing the gap. Because if you know where you are and where you need to be, putting a plan to shift that becomes your strategic initiatives.
And it's also really helpful in one-on-ones, right? Like, I think it's specifically interesting, and this is like the second scenario, is like you have a couple reps missing. There's a big question around the reps' ability to what they're calling from a forecast perspective versus what the math supports too. So like, you have a situation where a lot of reps are hitting and one rep is telling you, hey, I'm definitely going to hit plan. And I think we've all seen that rep who like over forecasts and like under delivers mathematically. But I think that's super important to have that math very clearly laid out for yourself, so that you can communicate it to them to say, hey, this is how much pipeline you've generated. We're halfway through the quarter, so here's how much pipeline I expect you at the current run rate to generate with the months we have left in the quarter. This is your close rate of that. Here's what you've closed so far. Here's the expected close rate of your open pipeline. Those three things combined to this number. You're telling me you're going to close, $250K this quarter. The math says 120. What am I missing? Like, why are you so confident in that number? And how are you going to so dramatically beat expectation? And I think that's where, on a rep missing, these types of coaching conversations are massively helpful.
Yeah, quick question in the chat. Is anybody here renewal manager, account manager that does quotas on renewals and upsells? We're talking a lot about new business generation. I don't know if we should add in a few post-initial sale quota examples. If it's all new business and general sales, and I think new business is still going to work here, but that's like a sales leader and an AE and an SDR. So yeah, so we got a few renewals people here. Anybody working with cross-sell, upsells, and renewals, the principles still apply, the numbers and the frameworks. You're looking at engineering renewal rates, upselling rates, net dollar retention, and really working backwards to figure out specific accounts of where they can start engineering that. But it ultimately comes back to setting up quotas off of that those same 2 or 3 key KPIs, and knowing that from an org perspective and a rep perspective, and it leads to this, which is, when you have a rep that's missing, sometimes there can be territory misalignments, and it's always worth looking at that. But I would say in general, you need to have on a per rep level those conversations. That's always going to come down to those key KPIs. If you built your quotas that way, it allows you to avoid the no one's buying they're hitting quota because my territory sucks, which has probably been used by every sales rep ever at every company. The grass is always greener. There's always that story that doesn't mean there's not some kernel of truth to it, but when you build quotas in a way that you can go back to and say, hey, in order to hit your quota, you need to be self-generating 3 deals a week, right? If inbound is doing this, or in the context of cross-selling and upselling, right? Upselling cross-sells maybe have a much higher close rate, so 40%, 60%. They may have a lower ACV, but if your expansion revenue target is baked off of those numbers, you can talk through that and say, hey, you're generating a lot of opportunities, but your close rate for upsells is 20%. People just aren't interested in buying, and your peers and the companies modeled off of 60%. So now you got opportunity to coach about qualification. How do you present that? Maybe if you've got an account manager or a CSM or however, a renewals manager, and you've got QBRs and you're presenting upsell opportunities, you're taking a quota number and you're building and zoning in specifically to that rep, what that rep needs to work on, because you know what that baseline should be. Similarly, if you went to a doctor and you're doing a diagnosis and you're saying, great, here's the baseline, this is off or this is lower, but you can't do that if you don't have a baseline. And so from a rep perspective, and lead perspective, you got to have a baseline for every comp plan that's created. And you ideally want to present that at the start of each quarter, so there's confidence of being like, hey, the reason you're giving this number is we have confidence you can hit these targets. And if you're off as an organization, here's what we're going to do this quarter to help out with that. We need to have an increased sales price, so we're launching a new product. That new product, we're hopefully going to increase our average sales price or our ACV, and here's why it's going to, et cetera. And so you're being able to tell the story more than just, here's your quota, sink or swim, which is where I think a lot of people feel, not just from a rep level, but VP down.
To Aaron's question specifically on like cross-sell, upsell, and renewal, I in that math tend to like to break those into 3 different like streams for a team member. So on the renewal side, a lot of you have a fixed book that's renewing in the period. And what I like to do with that is have very clear delineated stages of funnel progression towards a renewal, to say, hey, of these renewals, a renewal that is in a contract, I like to look at what day of the quarter they entered, whatever stage they're in, and then the probability that you're going to win that renewal or not. And so in the same way that you move pipeline down funnel on the new business side, you can move pipeline down funnel in a renewal side, and then have a very clear understanding mathematically of where is your gross revenue retention going to be. So renewal stages can be, they can be started renewal conversation, or like, include brought up renewal conversation, commercial term agreements, validated use case. And you can have these like started renewal conversation, like started conversation, validated use case, presented to champion, send contract, renewed, right? You can play around with these, but they're very clear decision points that have increased the probability that this renewal will win. And if you don't get to those, you're not going to renew. And so in the same way you have a new business set of stages, you can have a renewal set of stages correspondingly, and then you're mathematically deriving what you think the total renewed dollars you'd have off this fixed base. So you have 500K this quarter. Here's the projection of what's going to renew based on entering the quarter. Where was that? What stages was that pipeline in? Like if you haven't had any conversations, you're going to have a much lower renewal rate than if everything entering the quarter is already in like a validation stage or something like that. And then for the upsell and cross-sell, that is definitely much more similar to a new business model. How much upsell and cross-sell pipeline do I have to generate? What's my win rate? What's the average contract value? What are the stages of an upsell and a cross-sell? And the reason I treat them separately in my mind, and it's always been helpful for me leading a team like this, is that the renewal information is fixed. Like the renewal ops are fixed. You have the renewals going into the quarter. You don't have to generate any more renewal pipeline because they're all renewing. As opposed to upsell and cross-sell, you have to have much more of like a pipe gen component to this as well.
I would say for me, when it comes to renewals, what I would add is the renewal starts the day the original deal is sold. By the time you run the renewals playbook, you're pretty much locked in. And I say that if you want a renewal sales process in Quota starts a year in advance. So if you're like, hey, my renewal target in general is going to be this in a year, your renewal activities start now. A customer that doesn't onboard and activate isn't going to renew 9 months from now because you call them with a discount, right? So I like to implement customer health scores and colors, and even creating a huge value add to Path to Quota is when you do customer business review or QBRs, there's a lot of, you ask the CSM, like, hey, how's it? They're gonna be like, they're not renewing. They hate this product, or they're really upset, or and then everybody's like, what are you talking about? We haven't heard anything. But they're like, hey, I'm just telling you, I've been on these calls. I'm telling you what's going on. How do you get ahead of that? Because it's possible maybe they're underutilizing, maybe you're championing left. And so that's a gut call that I found health scores, not just the numbers, but the colors, red, yellow, green. You implement that to CRM. As soon as you hit that to red, that creates a Slack or some type of automation that will then tell your VP of sales, your CRO, your head of customer success, hey, the CEO themselves, the founders, we need to get involved. We have a churn risk because it's only 5 months in, but they haven't responded in 2 months. We thought they were great. I think the champion has left. So that's to me, that's a renewal playbook to hit your quota, because if your renewals target is based off of retention and growth, you obviously need logos to retain. And so a renewal playbook oftentimes starts 90 days at most, maybe 120 when you're starting those commercial conversations. But before that, you've got to get adoption, activation. They got to be happy. They want to stay engaged, land and expand. If somebody's buying additional product, those are all indications of future buys. And so the path to quota of a renewals starts significant, a sales cycle for new business is like 45 days to 90 for most products until you get to mid-market enterprise and a little higher. If you've got a renewal target, I would say you're winning that in the first 6 months, way before you run your actual renewal playbook. And that setting up things early on, who has not activated after 30 days? People don't rebuy a product they never used, right? So making have a great onboarding and implementation. Tracking at the beginning who's got activation or not, so that the right stakeholders are getting involved to make sure that they're moving that along. Once you're having regular check-ins, not just reporting, but really understanding the business objectives, running great QBRs, running CSMs drive renewals. The renewals is an outcome of your ability to solve problems that you agreed to in the very beginning of the contract. That's your reward as a company for solving those problems. So how do you build a path to renewal quota? You do that through great customer success, great account management, and do it in the first 6 months, not in the last. Because usually people are like, well, how do we hit our renewal target next quarter? I'm like, well, you're asking the wrong question. That's baked in. That's
and for this like 6 months. Yeah.
Typically. Yeah, like you need to be thinking through now, how do you improve renewals and your retention rates and your growth rates 2-3 quarters in advance. That's the fluid dynamic stuff that Ryan was talking about. Is a new business is an SDR, you can think in terms of weeks, right? Call, activity, book meeting, top of the funnel. An AE, look at that average sales cycle. They're looking in terms of 1 to 3 month range. You look at renewals, and now you're looking at a year-long process, so that you're engineering your renewal success 6-9 months in advance. I think that's the fluid dynamics component, Ryan, you've written about and talked about here is absolutely accurate. It just expands further out.
Yeah, and it's interesting. One thing that we do here that I particularly like is if you were to build some concept of a customer health score, like a quantitative probability to renew, what a lot of our customers will do is they'll then have that multiplied by the renewing ARR of the account. And so they'll have like a mathematical projection on a customer by customer level as to what their GRR will be 2, 3, 4, 5 quarters from now, which is, okay, in Q1 of 2026, these 15 customers are renewing. Each of them, you multiply their renewal probability by their renewing ARR, and you can actually just have a mathematical number of GRR. And so right now you're looking at Q1 of 26 and you're saying, okay, our like projected GRR for Q1 of 26 is 65%. How do we get that to 80, 85, 90%? And who are the biggest customers that are dragging down that projection because they're our largest, least happy customers, for example. And so like that's the path to quota for them is definitely much more forward looking, and management teams are looking at like Q1 and Q2 next year already in terms of a GRR perspective.
Yeah. Product analytics, I think that is huge, right? Like I said, if people aren't using their product regularly, they're not going to renew. It doesn't mean you can't save it, but that's a save play. That's a different conversation of how do you turn somebody around. But getting product analytics, working with your product team to talk through what are the key metrics, what indicates a healthy, customer, or the key components of product usage that indicates future growth opportunities. That also ties into upsells. How do you engineer upsells and growth opportunities? If you're seat-based, I've spent, as a purchaser, millions of dollars buying software, and I can't tell you how many times I had to reach out, like, I've hit my seat count. Can I buy more seats? I'm like, oh, sure, no problem. Why not have a notification that if somebody's at 90% seat count, that the CSM or the AM reaches out? Says, hey, I see you're reaching seat capacity. You want to have a discussion about, etc. Or most certainly at 100, or if you're usage-based, or for whatever you're selling, there are opportunities to generate upsell opportunities because of products. And now you're saying, great, your expansion and your growth opportunities is, let's call it 300K for this quarter. Well, how do you do it? You just email people new product offerings? Well, that's where PLG product integrations can come in and say, well, they've maximized this one. Why don't we cross-sell this? Or this is an ICP for new product launch. Or if it's usage-based or seat-based, making sure you're being proactive and understand cross-selling opportunities. If you sell 15 seats and you're 90 days in and they've only deployed 2, that's a red account, right? No one's going to renew 30 seats if they've only leveraged 2. And so now you're on month 3 of that initial contract, taking action to say, hey, how do we help? Looks like we started. Sounds like you guys are excited, but you've got some different initiatives. Can we help you deploy the rest of your usage for a platform or a product? And those are all path to quotas. Those are all things you're doing to help make sure that you've got great renewals and great adoption.
So Brantley, one last thing I think we wanted to talk a little bit about was you find yourself in a situation in which your org doesn't have a path to quota, right? Like this is the state that you're in. You don't feel like it's an attainable thing. Just the math isn't working, whether it's you don't have enough pipeline or you don't have the win rate that you wanted it to be. There's a million reasons, but you just fundamentally do not have a path to reasonable quota attainment. What do you do? Like what are some options for teams that find themselves in that scenario where they're running off a quota they don't have a shot to hit?
I don't think there's any rule in the playbook that says you have to do anything, right? And that means you can do anything you want. And so if somebody completely goose eggs as a company, I don't think it's crazy to adjust quotas mid-quarter if you're looking at it, because you have to look at rep retention. And if it's clearly a miss, there's something happening in the company or the market, and it's a huge whiff. I don't think it's crazy to look at guarantees, ramps, finding ways to make sure people feel whole. If you can demonstrate that it's not the rep's abilities. I think one of the things that really impacts companies is just the idea of just hire new reps. It takes you 60 days to hire, it takes you 3 months to ramp, and you've got maybe hopefully an 80% chance you can hit fully ramped. So backfilling somebody sets your ability to produce that revenue by 6 months with only 80% confidence, right? And so I think that people need to make sure that they're accounting for rep retention and making sure that reps after 1 or 2 quarters aren't going, hey, there's no chance. I was promised this OTE. I'm not hitting it. Nobody's hitting it. Now you've got retention issues. And so if there's a short-term adjustment to say, hey, we set these targets, we haven't been a generated pipeline we thought, this new product line hasn't adjusted, changing and adjusting things in quarters, creating spiffs, finding ways that make people feel motivated while still keeping the company on target, finding that right balance. all those things are in play.
Yeah, it's interesting. I tend to think so. There's a couple different routes you can take. One is, hey, can you modify quotas? If you feel like this is the team you want to invest in long term, can you modify quotas to be more attainable for the team? I think there's a trade-off conversation there, which naturally happens, which is one is, do you have the right number of reps? Like, are you so far off quota because you have 2 or 3 times the number of reps you need, just from like a carrying capacity perspective? There's a hard question of, do I have the right amount of headcount here to actually solve this problem? Especially because people, when they do quota modeling, forget base salary implications of having too many reps, right? But if you are going to reduce quota, it's a question of, hey, I think you have the opportunity to both narrow kind of upside and downside for reps. So if you tell a rep, I'm going to reduce your quota, 20% going into Q3 and Q4 to make it more achievable for you, you then as the leader absolutely have the right to say, because of that, we're going to reduce accelerators. We're going to like make the range of outcome much, much narrower. And then you do have to be very clear as to why this is different. Like, why do you think this is an achievable number? Same things we were talking about before. If you can't change quotas, which a lot of these people in this room may find themselves, hey, I just don't have a path to change this number. It's how do you, and you want to keep the reps engaged and happy, how do you give them wins, right? That are OT, that help them approach their on-target earnings in a way that can earn them great money, even if they can't hit quota. So really the push is, okay, you're not going to be able to hit your quota, but can you get as close to your on-target earnings as possible by changing the shape of the revenue you're bringing in? Can you shift from 10% of your new business contracts on multi-year deal to 50, 60, 70%? Can you sell more multiple products in the new business op? For renewals, can you drive a bunch of early renewals and be spiffed on that? So you want to figure out what are the things that if a rep is only going to be able to mathematically reasonably hit 70% of her quota, how can you get her as close to possible to OTE if you want to retain her by closing great revenue for the business? And so this is a problem that we tend to focus on with a lot of our customers is, in our product is pulling in all the mechanics of your comp plan so a rep can see, hey, I make 10% for a 1-year single product deal. I make 17% for a 2-year multi-product deal. I'm going to close more of those because it makes me more money and I can forecast that and it's better for the business. So if you do find yourself in this scenario, I think you have options on both sides of the coin for sure. I think that's kind of a best case to wrap up. I know we're kind of landing on time here, but really it's avoiding misses is understanding the math. I think there's a lot of bottoms up and top down math that Brantley and I both talked about. How, if you have to close X amount of revenue in Q3, how does it actually happen? Like, what are those fluid mechanics? And how do you give reps better visibility to understand their path, both in internal meetings and in providing them with tooling to like give them better visibility to understand how to close better revenue for the business. So I think that was the bulk of what we were looking to cover today. Thank you, Rev.Hub team, for having us. We really enjoyed the conversation. I don't know, Ty, if there's anything else you wanted to add as we wrap.
No, I think it's thanks a lot, Ryan, Brantley, for the time, for the insights. I think if anyone has maybe like 1 or 2 less questions, feel free to either open up your mic or just write in the chat.
Yeah, there was one. Ben had another one on like pros and cons of like
Yeah.
bottom up versus top down approaches. I think that
Specifically in
regardless of
early
stage-
stage.
Yeah.
So
Just-
I would say if it's early stage VC backed,
Yes.
yeah. So if you're early stage and VC backed, you raise money with the promise of hitting targets in general as a company. And so there's definitely, I think, there's a responsibility to have a plan to hit the target that's been presented. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do bottoms up. But again, I think about how do you generate strategy and tactics? It's going to be the gap from where you are and where you need to be, and thinking through specifically how to close that gap. If you're doing a bottoms up forecast and you're saying our quota is going to be this number, and we look at our commits and we look at our pipeline, that's going to give you your bottoms up number. It doesn't mean you panic it means you need to either as an individual or as a lead, put together a plan to close the gap. And that's where I think leadership comes in and saying, hey, great, we're going to hit this $2 million target, 5, 15, 50, depends on what early stage means, maybe $1 million, but we're feel confident we can hit 500,000 or 800,000, $1 million target. That's our commit. We've got a best case scenario, a few wills out there, but to close that gap, here's what we're going to do. And you go back up the pipeline to say, here are the activities we're going to do: sales development, marketing, demand gen. And that's where bottoms up and top down work together to create strategies, even if you don't have control over the numbers that need to be hit from a top down quota setting perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, I would argue that bottoms up is like most crucial in early stage or growth stage businesses, because you have to have a lot of confidence, like that what is the path to actually hitting that number? Like, what do you think your average contract value could be? How many deals do you reasonably think each person can close? What are the you have to have a framework. Now you're going to edit that dramatically over time, right? Your ACV is probably going to go up pretty dramatically year over year as you make pricing and targeting changes. But I think you have to get board confidence in your ability to hit that number. Your bottoms up is like massively, massively important to get them on board with your path to hit the number. Because so many growth leaders get in front of a board and say, hey, we can close $3 million this year. And then it's like, okay, how? It's very different to close, $310,000 customers or whatever the math is between, $3 million customers. It's a very different go-to-market motion. And so you want to have the bottoms up number, I think, is super important, because you want to have the narrative for that board as to this is what we expect. And then when you start to deviate from it, be transparent with them on why you're deviating. Like in every board conversation I've ever had, when I've ever missed a number, they don't want you to miss the number, obviously, but they certainly don't want you to miss the number, not be able to tell them dramatically, like definitively why and how you're going to fix it in the future. And that's where bottoms up is super important in growth stage models, in my opinion. Cool.
All right. Thanks.
Team, thank you very much for having us. If you have any comp plan questions, I'm more than happy to chat through them. I love talking comp plans. It's a weird thing that I really enjoy. Yeah, definitely check both Brantley and I out on LinkedIn and let us know if we can help. So thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Brantley. Thanks, everyone. I think Travis sent out all the details on the chat. Feel free to connect. And yeah, have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, team.